Jake Thompson wandered through the fluorescent-lit aisles of the local supermarket, each step weighed down by the crushing burden of his family's financial struggles. At 18, he had become all too familiar with the nagging sense of anxiety that came with bills piling up and his mother's increasingly worried expression. The shelves were lined with brightly colored packages that seemed to mock him as he passed, their prices glaringly out of reach. He caught sight of a family buying a cart full of groceries, laughter spilling from them like the contents of their cart. It felt like a world so far removed from his own. Jake stopped in front of the snack aisle, his stomach growling softly. He had skipped dinner last night, trying to save what little food they had for his younger sister, Lily. She deserved better than this. She deserved a life free from worry and want. He reached for a bag of chips without thinking, an automatic gesture born of desperation. His mind raced with thoughts of his mother's part-time job that barely covered the bills and how she often stayed up late, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. "I have to do something," he muttered under his breath, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. His heart raced as the idea formed in the back of his mind, a dark impulse that felt both foreign and familiar. He looked around, his palms sweaty, and his breath quickened. What if he just took a few things? It was just food, after all. He had seen others do it, people who looked like they were in worse situations than his. Just a few items, he whispered to himself, as if it were a justification. With a sudden burst of resolve, he slipped a few candy bars and a couple of small bags of chips into the pocket of his jacket, feeling the crinkled wrappers against his fingers. Panic surged as he made his way toward the exit, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, and he could almost hear the voice of his conscience screaming at him to stop. Yet all he could think about was Lily's smile and the way her eyes lit up when she had snacks to share with her friends. Just as he reached the automatic doors, a firm hand grasped his shoulder, spinning him around. "Hey, you!" a security guard barked, his expression hard and unyielding. Jake's stomach dropped, and he froze, the world spinning around him as the guard pulled him back inside. "What do you think you're doing?" I... I wasn't doing anything," Jake stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The fear coursing through him was overwhelming, and he felt the weight of his actions crashing down like a tidal wave. "Man, let me see what you've got in your pocket," the guard demanded, his eyes narrowing. Trembling, Jake knew there was no escaping now. He felt like a deer caught in headlights as he reluctantly pulled out the stolen items, the vibrant packaging now a glaring reminder of his desperation. Within moments, the police arrived, their presence sending a chill through Jake's spine. He was led outside, the harsh, cold air biting at his skin as he was placed in the back of a patrol car. The door slammed shut behind him, and he could hear the faint sound of his heartbeat in his ears. The officer driving turned around momentarily, a sympathetic frown creasing his brow. "You know this isn't the way, kid," he said softly, but Jake couldn't bear to meet his gaze. Sitting there, Jake felt utterly hopeless. He thought of his mother, of the disappointment he was about to bring upon her. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, the weight of regret pressing down on his chest. The reality of his actions settled in, heavy and suffocating. He had wanted to help his family, to ease their suffering, but all he had done was dig them deeper into a hole that felt impossible to escape. As the patrol car pulled away from the supermarket, Jake realized that this was just the beginning of a long, dark road ahead. The consequences of his actions hung over him like a storm cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed an unforgivable line. Jake sat on the cold, hard bench of the holding cell, the harsh, fluorescent lights flickering above him. The cacophony of distant voices and the clanging of metal echoed through the drab walls, amplifying his sense of isolation. He felt the shame wash over him like a tide, pulling him deeper into despair. How did he end up here? The weight of his family's financial struggles had led him to this moment, yet it felt surreal, like a nightmare from which he could not awaken. With his head hung low, Jake traced the outline of the concrete floor with his eyes. Each crack seemed to symbolize the fractures in his life, the choices he had made that had culminated in this humiliating failure. He could almost hear his mother's voice in his head, weary and burdened, asking him why he hadn't reached out for help instead of resorting to theft. I was just trying to help us, he murmured to himself, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Suddenly, the heavy door of the cell creaked open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside. Officer Ramirez was a burly man with a stern expression, but his eyes softened slightly as he looked at Jake. "You're up for processing, kid," he said gruffly, gesturing for Jake to stand. "Let's get this over with." Jake rose slowly, feeling every muscle in his body protest against the movement. As he stepped out into the fluorescent-lit hallway, he caught a glimpse of other detainees, some angry, some despondent, all trapped in their own stories of regret. He felt a pang of empathy, but quickly pushed it aside. He had his own problems to face. After being fingerprinted and photographed, Jake was led to another room for a search. Officer Ramirez stood beside him, flipping through the contents of his pockets. "You've got a real mess on your hands, you know that?" the officer commented, holding up the stolen snacks Jake had attempted to pilfer. "You think this is the way out?" Jake shrugged, unable to meet the officer's gaze. "I didn't know what else to do," he mumbled, the admission tasting like defeat. "Everyone has a choice, kid. You just made the wrong one," Ramirez replied, his voice softer now, as if he were attempting to impart some wisdom rather than merely scold. But before Jake could respond, the officer's fingers brushed against something else in the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, unfolding it with curiosity. "What's this?" Ramirez asked, eyeing Jake suspiciously. He began to read aloud, the words resonating in the stillness of the room. "Dear Jake, if you're reading this, then you've probably faced challenges that seem insurmountable. I want you to know that you are not alone. You are the grandson of Harold Thompson, a man who disappeared many years ago under mysterious circumstances. He left behind a fortune that could change your life." Jake's heart raced as he listened, disbelief washing over him. How could this be real? The letter continued, revealing details about a hidden inheritance and a family legacy he had never even known existed. Ramirez paused, looking at Jake with newfound interest. "You're related to the Thompson family? The one that made all that money in the 90s? I... I didn't know," Jake stammered, his mind racing. Suddenly, the gravity of his situation shifted. This wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about a legacy he had never imagined. "Seems like you might have a way out after all," Officer Ramirez remarked, folding the letter back up and placing it on the table. "But it's not going to be easy. You'll have to navigate some murky waters, kid." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of hope and trepidation. The prospect of a fortune was tantalizing, but it also came with a weight of expectation and responsibility. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "First, get your head straight. You need to figure out what you want and if this is the path you want to take. You can't just walk away from this," Ramirez advised, his tone serious yet understanding. Jake took a deep breath, the enormity of the situation settling in. "I'll need to learn about my family and this fortune," he said, determination creeping into his voice. "Then that's where you start," Ramirez replied, giving Jake a nod of encouragement. As the officer turned to leave, Jake realized he stood on the precipice of a new life, one that could either redeem him or lead him further down a dark path. The choice was his, but the journey had only just begun. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the holding area where Jake sat, still grappling with the whirlwind of emotions that had engulfed him since the moment he was caught stealing. The news of his lineage had spread like wildfire, the whispers of his identity echoing down the corridors, drawing curious onlookers and media personnel to the scene. Jake felt like a specimen under a microscope, every gaze heavy with expectation and judgment. "Is it true?" a voice called out from beyond the barred window of his holding cell. It was a reporter, her notepad at the ready, poised to capture his every word. "Are you really the grandson of Richard Thompson?" Jake looked up, his heart racing. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, the weight of his past pressing down on him. "I'm just a kid who made a mistake." "Come on, Jake," she pressed, her pen dancing over the page. "This could change everything for you. You could be wealthy. You could—" "Stop," Jake interrupted, his voice rising in frustration. "You don't understand. This isn't a fairy tale. I'm still the same person who just tried to steal food. As the reporter's face fell, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and a woman emerged, her presence commanding and assured. She wore a tailored suit and had an air of confidence that immediately drew Jake's attention. She introduced herself as Sarah, a lawyer specializing in inheritance cases. "Jake, I've heard all about you," she said, her tone gentle yet firm. "I'm here to help you navigate this situation. You have a lot to consider, and it's crucial that you have someone in your corner." Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. "Help me? With what? I don't want anything to do with this fortune. I just want to go home." "Home?" Sarah echoed, crossing her arms. "With your family struggling as they are? You have an opportunity here, Jake. One that could change your life and theirs. But it won't be easy." He stared at her, uncertainty swirling in his gut. Could he really embrace this new identity? The thought of his mother's struggle weighed heavily on him. "What do I have to do?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "First, we need to establish your rights to the inheritance," she explained, her eyes unwavering. "You'll have to meet with the estate's executors and possibly confront some family members you've never met. This is a complicated situation, and I'll be with you every step of the way." Jake felt a strange mix of hope and dread. What if they don't want me? What if I'm just a reminder of what they lost? "Then we'll face it together," she replied, her voice steady. "But you need to be prepared. There will be people who see you as a threat and others who might want to use you for their gain. You must stay strong." As Jake considered her words, the reality of his situation hit him like a tidal wave. He was suddenly thrust into a world of expectations and family secrets, a world he hadn't even known existed. Would he have to choose between pursuing this fortune and staying true to his roots? Just then, a loud commotion erupted outside the holding area. The chatter of voices grew louder, and Jake could see the silhouettes of people gathering near the entrance. "What's happening?" he asked, turning to Sarah. "Probably members of your family," she said, her expression shifting to one of concern. "They've come to see you." Jake's heart raced. His mind was a chaotic blend of emotions: anxiety, excitement, fear. He didn't know what to expect when these strangers, his relatives, entered his life. Would they embrace him or reject him? He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the unknown. A man stepped forward, his features sharp and eyes piercing. "Jake, it's me, your Uncle Thomas," he announced, his voice booming through the small space. "We need to talk about your future." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of expectations settle on his shoulders. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. The door to his past had opened, and now he had to decide whether to walk through it or turn back. As Jake sat in the small, dimly lit office of Sarah, the lawyer, he felt the weight of his newfound identity pressing down on him. The room was cluttered with stacks of files, old photographs, and various legal documents that spoke of family histories long forgotten. He could almost hear the whispers of the past echoing through the space, urging him to uncover the truth about his grandfather's disappearance. "All right, Jake," Sarah said, her voice steady and encouraging. "The first step is to gather as much information as we can about your grandfather. We need to find anyone who knew him well. Friends, business associates, anyone who can shed light on his life before he vanished." Jake nodded, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Where do we start?" Sarah smiled, pulling out a dusty binder filled with yellow documents. "I've dug up some old family records and newspaper articles. Let's take a look at this together. I think it will give us a solid foundation." They spent hours sifting through the contents of the binder, piecing together a timeline of Jake's grandfather's life. As they read, a picture began to emerge of a man who was both revered and reviled. Successful in business, but embroiled in a bitter feud with other family members over his fortune. "This," Jake said, pointing to a newspaper clipping, "says there was a huge argument at a family gathering just days before he disappeared. What could have happened that night?" "It's possible that the feud escalated," Sarah replied, her brow furrowed in thought. "We need to find out who was there and what they remember. It could lead us to answers." Jake felt a surge of determination. He wanted to understand the man who had left him this legacy, both the fortune and the chaos that came with it. "Let's reach out to some of those family friends. Maybe they can help us." Sarah nodded in agreement, and they began drafting a list of names. As they worked, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What if he found out that his grandfather had been involved in something dangerous, something that could explain why he vanished? A few days later, they set out to interview an elderly family friend named Mr. Hargrove, who had known Jake's grandfather well. The old man lived in a modest house lined with photographs of a life well lived. When they arrived, he welcomed them with a warm smile, though his eyes held a hint of sadness. "Ah, Jake," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice trembling with age. "I've heard about you. It's good to see you. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, but he had his demons." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, leaning forward, eager for any insight. Mr. Hargrove sighed, his gaze drifting to the window. "There was a rift in the family, you see. Your grandfather was driven, ambitious, but it came at a cost. He didn't always play fair in business, and it alienated many people, including his own brother." "Did they ever reconcile?" Jake pressed, his heart pounding at the thought of unresolved issues. "No," Mr. Hargrove said, shaking his head. "It only got worse. They had a falling out over a deal that went south. I remember the last time I saw your grandfather. He looked haunted, like he was carrying a heavy burden." Jake's stomach twisted. "What happened that night? The night he disappeared?" Mr. Hargrove hesitated, his eyes narrowing. There were whispers of something sinister. Some said he was involved with unsavory characters. He had enemies, Jake. People who wouldn't think twice about taking him out of the picture if it suited their purposes. "Enemies?" Jake echoed, feeling a chill run down his spine. "You mean he was in danger?" "Possibly," the old man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you must understand, the family was torn apart by greed and jealousy. Your grandfather may have left to escape it all, but the circumstances surrounding his disappearance were complicated." Jake felt a knot tightening in his chest. The more they uncovered, the more he realized that the fortune he had inherited was intertwined with shadows of betrayal and loss. As they left Mr. Hargrove's house, Jake turned to Sarah, his mind racing. "What now? How do we find out more about those enemies?" "We dig deeper," she replied, determination lighting her eyes. "We need to find anyone else who can provide information. There are still relatives and friends out there. We'll figure this out together." Just as hope began to spark in Jake's heart, a voice called out from behind them. "Jake, wait up!" They turned to see a girl with bright red hair and a friendly smile approaching them. "I'm Emily, your cousin," she said, extending her hand enthusiastically. "I heard you were looking into our family history. I'm really into genealogy, and I'd love to help." Jake felt a rush of camaraderie wash over him. "Really? That would be amazing. The more, the merrier." "Great. I've got some old family trees and documents I can share," Emily said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I think we can uncover some intriguing stories together." As they walked together, Jake felt a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in weeks. For the first time since everything had spiraled out of control, he didn't feel alone in this journey. With Emily by his side, he was ready to face whatever truths lay ahead, even if they were shrouded in darkness. Jake and Emily sat in the dim light of the cramped attic, surrounded by dusty boxes and cobwebs that seemed to wrap the forgotten memories in a shroud of neglect. The air was thick with the musty scent of old paper and aged wood, which mingled with the anticipation of discovery. After several hours of sifting through family relics, they had stumbled upon a nondescript leather-bound journal that seemed to pulse with history. "Do you think it's really his?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she carefully brushed off the dust from the cover. "There's only one way to find out," Jake replied, his heart racing with the thrill of the unknown. He opened the journal, revealing pages filled with neat, cursive handwriting. The first entry was dated several years before his grandfather's disappearance. As Jake read aloud, the words seemed to come alive in the stillness of the attic. "I've made choices that weigh heavily on my conscience. The business is not what it appears to be." Emily leaned in closer, her eyes wide with intrigue. "What do you think he meant by that? Shady dealings?" Jake paused, his thoughts swirling. "It sounds like he was involved in something dangerous. Maybe that's why he disappeared." He flipped through more pages, each entry revealing snippets of his grandfather's life. A man torn between ambition and morality. Listen to this, he said, reading another entry. I fear for my family's safety. There are people I can't trust, and I must keep my distance until I can find a way out. This is getting intense, Emily said, biting her lip. Do you think this has anything to do with the fortune? Maybe. If he was involved in something illegal, it could explain why he left everything behind, Jake replied, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. But it also makes me wonder if he's still alive. The tension in the attic grew palpable as they shared a moment of silence, the implications of Jake's discovery settling over them like a heavy fog. Suddenly, Emily broke the stillness, her voice trembling with urgency. We need to tell Sarah. She'll know what to do with this. Yeah, but what if she decides to keep it from the rest of the family? Jake countered, anxiety creeping into his tone. What if she wants the fortune for herself? Emily frowned, considering his words. We have to trust her. She's been nothing but helpful. Besides, we can't keep this to ourselves. Jake nodded reluctantly, feeling the weight of the journal in his hands. All right, let's head back. We need to confront this family mess before it consumes us. As they descended the attic stairs, the atmosphere shifted from excitement to dread. The family dynamics had already become tense since the news of Jake's inheritance had spread, and now with the journal's implications, he could sense the storm brewing. The moment they entered the living room, they were met with a charged atmosphere. Several family members were gathered, their voices rising in heated debate. Jake's heart sank as he recognized the familiar faces, his aunts and uncles, their expressions a mix of greed and desperation. Jake! Emily! You're just in time, one of his uncles called out, his tone deceptively cheerful. We were just discussing how to best handle your grandfather's estate. Yeah, that's one way to put it, Emily muttered under her breath as they approached the group. Listen, we've all been through a lot, Jake began, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. But I think we need to talk about something important. His words were drowned out by a chorus of objections. You're too young to understand, one aunt snapped. This is a business, not a playground. Enough! Jake raised his voice, surprising even himself. I found something that changes everything. He clutched the journal tightly, its presence a talisman against the rising tide of conflict. All eyes turned to him, curiosity piqued. What do you mean? His uncle asked, skepticism etched on his face. With a deep breath, Jake revealed the journal's existence. It's my grandfather's journal. It talks about his life, the business, and things he was involved in that could threaten us all. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. He could see the flicker of fear and uncertainty in their eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce determination. I knew it! He was hiding something! Another aunt shouted, her face flushed with anger. We deserve to know what he left us. Not just the money, Emily interjected, her voice rising. We need to understand the truth of who he was. If there's danger involved, we're all at risk. Jake felt the tension snapping like a taut string, and for a moment he was caught in the crossfire of conflicting loyalties, his family's chaos and his own quest for truth. Just as he thought they might rally around the journal, a wave of hostility erupted, accusations flying, and Jake was left wondering if the fortune was worth the turmoil it brought into his life. Maybe I should have just stayed a nobody, he muttered to himself, the chaos swirling around him as he questioned the very foundation of his identity. Jake sat in the dimly lit office of the private investigator, Mr. Collins, a man whose age mirrored the weight of the secrets he carried. The walls were adorned with faded photographs and newspaper clippings, remnants of investigations long past. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something akin to loss. Jake could feel his heart racing as he leaned forward in his chair, desperate to grasp the truth about his grandfather. Jake, Mr. Collins began, his voice gravelly yet steady, what I'm about to tell you isn't easy to swallow. Your grandfather, he didn't just disappear, he faked his own death. Jake's mind whirled at the revelation. Why would he do that? He struggled to absorb the implications. The man he had long believed to be dead was alive, possibly living a life cloaked in shadows. Dangerous enemies, Mr. Collins replied, his gaze unwavering. He was involved in things that went far beyond ordinary business dealings. There were threats to his life, people who wanted him gone for good. He had to make a choice, and he chose to disappear. Jake felt a mixture of shock and anger. So all of this, the fortune, the family drama, it stems from his choices? Was he even thinking about us? The weight of his family's struggles crashed down on him anew, tainted now by the knowledge of a legacy rooted in deception. Mr. Collins sighed, leaning back in his chair. I can't speak for his thoughts, but the fortune you seek is tied to a powerful secret. It's not just about money, Jake. Your grandfather's life was entangled with things that could put you in danger if they were ever uncovered. Danger, Jake echoed, feeling the chill of fear creep into his bones. What kind of danger? The kind that comes from people with power, those who don't play by the rules. If your grandfather is still alive, it means he may have enemies who won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stands in their way, including you. Jake's mind raced as he processed the investigator's words. He had thought that uncovering his family's history was the key to understanding himself, but now it felt more like opening a Pandora's box. So what do I do? He asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Mr. Collins leaned forward, his expression serious. You need to be careful. Trust no one, not even those who claim to be your family. The truth is a double-edged sword. It can set you free, but it can also cost you everything. Just as Jake began to digest the weight of those words, his phone buzzed violently against the wooden table. The sound startled him, pulling him from his troubled thoughts. He glanced down and saw a message notification, its content causing his heart to race anew. I know where he is. Who's that? Jake whispered, his throat dry. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a primal instinct warning him that he was being watched. He looked back at Mr. Collins, whose brow furrowed in concern. I don't know, but you need to take this seriously, Mr. Collins warned, his tone urgent. You might be in immediate danger. We should— No, Jake interrupted, shaking his head. He felt a sudden surge of determination. I need to know who sent this. I can't keep running away from my past. If there's a chance my grandfather's alive, I have to find him. Jake, this isn't a game, Mr. Collins cautioned. You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with. Then help me understand, Jake insisted, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. I can't back down now. I've come too far. Mr. Collins studied him for a moment, his expression softening. All right, but you need to promise me you'll stay alert. You can't trust anyone until we figure out what's really going on. Jake nodded, determination igniting within him. As they began to strategize their next steps, a sense of purpose washed over him. The shadows of his past were no longer just burdens. They were the key to unlocking his future. But with that key came a warning. The doors he was about to open might lead to a darkness he had never anticipated.